Hello, my friends. I'm Scott Ritter. Today, we're going to clarify what is really happening on the global chessboard. Fast headlines are no longer enough. There are facts that show a historic shift. The United States, under the administration of Donald Trump, is caught in a storm of internal political conflict, while simultaneously conducting negotiations that could redefine the map of Eastern Europe. And Russia is no longer on the defensive. It sets the tempo of the conflict in the United States. Internal crisis plus a narrative of strength. Trump has immediately tied a shooting against the National Guard to the country's migration crisis. This isn't a coincidence. Criminality equals associated with mass immigration. Migration equals existential threat. Solution equals total shutdown plus deportations plus reverse migration. A political narrative based on the idea that Western civilization is under attack. Trump isn't only speaking to his electoral base, he is building the national security argument that will legitimize his international moves, including his approach to Russia. Putin opens the door because he controls the room. Putin confirms that there is an American plan on the table, not a media show, but a serious proposal coordinated with Ukraine and Brussels. The United States will have to negotiate where Russia wants, likely in Moscow, and under the conditions Russia already imposed on the ground: Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk, and of course, Crimea. Trump would agree to recognize those territories as part of Russia to force an end to the conflict. American diplomacy is breaking with tradition. Washington is adopting Russian language, not European language, and that reveals something. Ukraine no longer has the ability to decide anything for itself. A reality they can no longer hide. While Zelensky keeps demanding security guarantees, the country is collapsing internally. Anti-corruption investigations reach the president's closest circle, a $100 million scandal in the energy sector. Political legitimacy in crisis due to the lack of elections. A devastating winter underway. The Kremlin itself states Ukraine is legally and militarily incapacitated to negotiate anything. And the most revealing sign, the West is already talking about post-Ukraine. NATO admits what it once denied. The Secretary General now states publicly Russian missiles can strike anywhere in the alliance within minutes. Germany would become the forward line platform, with up to 800,000 troops crossing its territory. Europe sees itself in a war, even if it refuses to admit it. Denmark goes as far as creating a night watch force just to monitor what Trump does. Pure fear. Latin America and the Middle East. Washington loses influence. Venezuela threatens to transform into an armed republic. If the U.S. attempts any ground intervention, Maduro has an escape route to Turkey, thanks to Erdogan. Iran openly declares the U.S. has failed on every front, from Ukraine to the Middle East. Intelligence reports confirm Iran continues funding Hezbollah with new routes despite sanctions. Washington punches the air, a lot of noise, very little impact. Meanwhile, headlines try to distract. NASA announces signals consistent with dark matter at the center of the galaxy. Talk of planetary defense, meteors, comets, astrophysics. Yes, fascinating science, but also a convenient media curtain to hide the West's geopolitical decline. Conclusion: the board has already changed. Europe repeats that its security depends on Ukraine, but Ukraine is already lost materially. The United States wants to save face by negotiating the terms of defeat, and Russia waits for Washington to officially recognize what has already been conquered. The question is no longer who will win. That phase is over. Now, the question is who will accept the new reality first. All signs point to the West being forced to acknowledge it, while Moscow sets the rules of the era that begins. I'm Scott Ritter, and we will continue analyzing what many still do not dare to say. If we want to understand where we are going, we must stop listening to speeches and start examining the real incentives of each actor. The U.S. does not talk about peace because it suddenly discovered compassion. It talks about peace because the cost of sustaining this war has become politically toxic. Trump knows it. A tired economy, a population exhausted by foreign wars, divided European allies, a military-industrial complex unable to promise quick victories, and in this context, recognizing Russian-controlled territories is not betrayal, but the silent admission that the balance of power no longer favors the West. Russia, for its part, is not in a hurry. Who controls the land controls the calendar. Moscow is willing to negotiate, not from weakness, but from the conviction that time erodes its adversaries. Europe enters winter with energy fears and political fractures. The U.S. heads into increasingly polarized elections. Ukraine loses population, infrastructure, and legitimacy. This peace plan looks less like a negotiation among equals and more like damage control by Washington and Brussels. Here is the key point. Almost no one dares to say, if Trump formally recognizes Crimea, Donbass, Zaporizhia, and Kherson as Russian territory, what remains of the Western narrative of the last years? It would mean accepting that all the sacrifices, all the sanctions, all the rhetoric about defending democracy to the last Ukrainian end in a document that legitimizes exactly what they swore to prevent. Europe will have to look in the mirror and admit it has lost more than influence. It has lost strategic autonomy. Its security, energy, and economy subordinated to decisions made in Washington. The result, a war it cannot win and a peace it cannot define. Meanwhile, the world does not wait for Europe or the U.S. Russia strengthens alliances in Eurasia and the Middle East. China observes, measures, and learns. Regional powers like Iran, Turkey, and even Venezuela challenge an order once considered unquestionable. The narrative of Western leadership now survives more by media inertia than by concrete facts. We are not witnessing a simple border adjustment, but a dress rehearsal for a new era. If Washington signs an agreement that cements Russia's territorial gains, the message to the planet will be clear. Strategic resilience and control of reality matter more than hashtags and summit speeches. The real questions now are, what will this mean for NATO's credibility? How will nations dependent on the U.S. security umbrella react? How many European leaders can politically survive supporting a losing strategy when the narrative collapses? Political careers collapse next, sometimes entire states. What is being decided is not just Ukraine's future, but the place each great power will occupy in the world to come. And when the media noise fades, only this will remain. Borders, trade routes, new alliances, and the bitter memory of a war many called inevitable, but was simply the result of bad strategic decisions. We follow the thread further. The West is not only losing a war, it is losing control of the narrative. For years, we were told the story was already written. The West leads. The West decides. The West assigns winners and losers. But now, before our eyes, the unthinkable is happening. A country dismissed as a gas station with nukes has proven that discipline, industrial resilience, and clarity of purpose can defeat the myth of Western superiority. And that terrifies many capitals. Because if Russia can do it, who's next? Saudi Arabia? India? Brazil? South Africa? The blocks are shifting. Old hegemonies are no longer unquestionable. More and more nations are realizing aligning with Washington no longer ensures security or prosperity. It ensures paying the price for wars you never chose. Europe is already paying. Expensive energy, forced militarization, industries leaving for the U.S., loss of diplomatic relevance. All this for what? To end up negotiating what Moscow demanded on day one. This is not just a military defeat. It is an intellectual, moral, and strategic defeat. We are living a hinge moment in history. Those who do not see it today will soon ask, when did the world change? And the answer will be, while you were reading headlines about heroes and villains, the balance of power was rewritten without your permission. If Trump signs a deal that validates Russia's territorial reality, Western propaganda collapses instantly. Brussels knows it. That is why it demands unity while trembling inside. Washington knows it. That is why it must present a retreat as a moral victory. But Putin only needs the world to acknowledge what is already a settled fact. In this war, the one who controlled the terrain imposed the politics. The one who endured the attrition imposed the conditions. The one who stayed calm imposed the future. Western leaders will say they fought for values. Strategists will say they lost to illusions. The next phase will be even more revealing: internal political breakdowns, cross accusations, attempts to rewrite history. But it will be too late. A new question will dominate. Who will build the next world order? Because one era is dying and another has already begun without asking for permission. The West no longer writes the rules. It reacts to rules written by others. Nations that were once spectators are now central players. And when the world recognizes that Russia has won in Ukraine, it won't be just a diplomatic capitulation. It will be the global signal that Western hegemony has reached the end of its historical cycle. That will be the exact moment when history changes hands. The power no longer flows toward Washington. The power flows toward those who take the initiative: Saudi Arabia, India, China, Africa, Eurasia, the global South. This is the new reality. The harshest blow to the West is psychological, discovering that the world can function without it, discovering that its threats no longer intimidate, discovering that its power was never as solid as it believed. The West bet on a narrative. Russia bet on reality. Reality won. Europe will ask, how did we lose a conflict we never really fought? Washington will ask, when did we stop deciding everyone else's future? The answer: when fear changed sides. I'm Scott Ritter, and what we are witnessing isn't the end of a war. It is the beginning of a new world. The only question now is, who is prepared to live in it, and who will cling to a past that will never return? And I want to walk you through what is really happening right now on the global chessboard, because all these apparently separate headlines: Ukraine, Russia, Europe, Venezuela, Trump, narco-terrorism in the Caribbean, are in fact part of the same strategic story. And if you don't connect them, you miss the point of where the world is heading. We are at a critical moment in Ukraine. Russia has just announced the full capture of Pokrovsk in the east, a city that was previously a key logistical hub for the Ukrainian army. And Vladimir Putin is very clear about what that means. He calls it a major victory after a long campaign and describes Pokrovsk not just as a piece of infrastructure, but as a springboard from which Russian forces can advance comfortably in all directions to complete the objectives of the special military operation. From that same podium, Putin is also talking about Kupiansk, explaining that the main part of the city is already completely in Russian hands, that fighting continues in surrounding districts, and that around 15 Ukrainian battalions are effectively encircled and being ground down. He says openly that it's only a matter of days before those areas are fully cleared. At the same time, he invites Western and even Ukrainian journalists to come and see Pokrovsk and Kupiansk with their own eyes, arguing that Kyiv has lost control of these places and that it is only fear and threats from the Ukrainian foreign ministry that prevent the Western press from admitting it. This battlefield reality coincides with political collapse in Kyiv. Deputies from European Solidarity have blocked the rostrum of the Verkhovna Rada, demanding the resignation of the government, denouncing a triple crisis at the front: in corruption and in relations with Western partners during peace negotiations, and nearly 100 deputies have already signed a bill to push out officials implicated in the Mindyk corruption scandal. Zelensky faces a crisis of legitimacy. postponed elections, and growing anger in a parliament that increasingly sees him as an obstacle rather than a leader, and that internal Ukrainian instability matters because it shapes what kind of peace or capitulation Kyiv can accept. While all this is unfolding, another theater is heating up: Venezuela. The United States has requested authorization from Caracas to resume repatriation flights for Venezuelan migrants from U.S. Territory, and Maduro has approved the entry of specific U.S. operated aircraft into Venezuelan airspace for this purpose. On the surface, it's bureaucratic flight numbers, aircraft registrations, technical details, but behind it is a much larger confrontation. Donald Trump has issued an ultimatum to Maduro to leave power, deploying a significant naval and military posture near Venezuela. Maduro responds with mockery, literally dancing on television, making light of Trump's threats. But treating this as a joke is a serious miscalculation. Trump is not the type of leader who moves carrier groups and orders kinetic operations just for theatrics. When he spends military capital, he expects results. Already, we've seen precise strikes against narco boats in the Caribbean. Those are not symbolic. The Pentagon's press secretary now openly talks about 21 kinetic strikes on drug-running vessels with 82 narco-terrorists killed, and she makes it clear that these operations are executed under the authority of President Trump as acts of defense of U.S. national interests and homeland security. There is also, inside the Pentagon, a contingency plan for what happens if Maduro leaves power and tries to unleash chaos through guerrilla warfare, armed militias, or engineered anarchy, because for years the Chavista regime has armed and trained territorial militias, distributing perhaps 200,000 Kalashnikov rifles to loyalists who are not regular soldiers but party militants, backed by layers of security forces, police, National Guard, and parallel structures. Venezuela cannot resist a sustained U.S. naval and air campaign, but it can make an occupation or regime change scenario extremely messy. That is the leverage Maduro believes he still has as he bargains for amnesties and guarantees. Trump, however, is not framing this in terms of electoral legitimacy anymore. He is framing Maduro and the so-called Cartel of the Suns as a narco-terrorist threat to U.S. national security. That shift in framing from democracy talk to hard security means Washington is less interested in Maduro's conditions and more interested in neutralizing him with the least cost in American lives. This is where we see the emerging multipolar order in action. Russia insists on its right to enforce its will in what it calls its near abroad eastern Ukraine, Donbass, Crimea, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia territories that Moscow considers permanently absorbed into the Russian Federation and no longer subject to negotiation. The United States, in parallel, claims the Caribbean and northern South America as its own security sphere, refusing to accept a hostile regime in Caracas tied to narco-trafficking and external rivals. China moves around Taiwan. Japan hints at deployments near the island. India talks with Russia about energy and connectivity. Great powers are carving out de facto zones of influence and declaring that within those zones, they will not compromise on core security demands. Europe, and especially France, finds itself confused in this new world. On the one hand, French military leaders talk loosely, recklessly, in fact, about the idea of a preventive strike by NATO against Russia, language that leaks to the press and provokes exactly the kind of response we've just heard from Putin. On the other hand, France sometimes tries to act like a medium power in a multipolar system, aligning with U.S. initiatives in places like the Western Sahara or the broader Atlantic strategy. But in Ukraine, it still clings to old illusions about imposing Western conditions on Moscow. Putin's new message to Europe is his clearest yet. He says openly that Russia does not seek a war with Europe. But if Europe chooses to start one, Russia is already prepared to respond. That the conflict with Ukraine is not even a war in the classical sense, but a series of surgical strikes, and that against Europe it would be different, so different that there might quickly be no one left with whom to negotiate. This is a barely veiled nuclear warning, and it must be read as such. Russia has long had a doctrine that allows for the use of nuclear weapons in response to a large-scale conventional attack that threatens the existence of the state, and Putin is simply restating that doctrine in plain language. The context matters. For years, NATO has gradually escalated its involvement in Ukraine, sending increasingly long-range systems, integrating its intelligence, targeting, and command infrastructure into Ukrainian strikes, and even allowing attacks on Russian early warning assets, moves that under Russian doctrine are themselves casus belli for nuclear response. Moscow deliberately avoided taking the bait, knowing that those provocations were designed to drag it into a direct confrontation with NATO and to change a war it was winning by attrition into a war it could lose politically. But there comes a point where failing to draw clear red lines simply normalizes escalation. With Dragon and others now speaking casually of preventive action against Russia, Putin is closing that permissive window and telling European elites one more step. And this stops being a proxy war and becomes an existential nuclear standoff that Europe, with its limited nuclear arsenal and high population density, cannot possibly survive. At the same time, Russia is threatening to cut Ukraine off completely from the sea if Kyiv continues attacks on Russian tankers and maritime infrastructure, and warning that it will not only hit Ukrainian port facilities but also target vessels of third countries that help Ukraine conduct what Moscow calls acts of piracy. All of this is happening while Europe is being pushed out of the real negotiations. European leaders are offended to find themselves sidelined, but Putin reminds them that they removed themselves. They cut off direct contacts, embraced the fantasy of a strategic defeat for Russia, and now, seeing that reality does not match their narrative, they try to sabotage any peace effort that might succeed, especially one led by Trump and his team. They have no peace agenda. They are aligned with war. Whenever they attempt to amend Trump's peace proposals, their goal is obvious: make the terms unacceptable to Russia, then blame Moscow for the failure. Russia sees this clearly. The result is that the core talks are now bilateral, the United States and Russia, with Ukraine as a dependent actor and Europe relegated to the role of noisy bystander. Washington's internal configuration matters here. There is a deliberate transition of power underway in U.S. foreign policy. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner emerge as key envoys, especially toward Moscow and the Middle East. The legacy of the Abraham Accords is revived. Gulf states and Israel are repositioned. And, above all, Marco Rubio becomes the central figure of the new administration's geopolitical architecture as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor combined. Rubio is not a fringe ideologue. He is bilingual, bicultural, and has spent years thinking about Latin America, Russia, China, and global security. In his Senate confirmation hearings, he avoided rhetorical excess and projected a pragmatic toughness that reassures allies and adversaries alike. He is, crucially, the steward of Trump's 28-point peace plan for Ukraine, a plan now reportedly condensed to 18 points, which seeks to recognize the reality that Russia has effectively won the war on the ground while still giving Ukraine and the West enough face-saving structure to accept a ceasefire and a new security architecture. That plan is being tuned, adjusted, trimmed, and shaped so that it does not drive Russia away while coaxing Ukraine, under enormous military and political pressure, into acceptance. On the Russian side, the FSB had already laid out a timeline: no serious negotiations before January 2026, giving Moscow time to secure key territories including critical rare earth deposits and strategic industrial zones in eastern Ukraine, and to consolidate its legal, military, and economic grip. They view everything taken since 2014, Crimea included, as non-negotiable acquisitions that must be recognized de facto, if not de jure. This is why they keep pushing field by field, town by town, often gaining the equivalent of dozens of football fields a day. The fall of Pokrovsk fits that pattern. Russia's long-term aim is to ensure that all this territory is beyond the reach of Western diplomacy. Meanwhile, Ukraine, as a functioning state, is collapsing. Its economy is destroyed, its infrastructure shredded by systematic strikes on power grids and key nodes, its demographic base gutted by casualties and mass immigration, and the cost of reconstruction is heading toward $1 trillion, a figure no donor conference can realistically fund unless Ukraine is rebuilt as a viable energy, grain, and industrial exporter, not as a broken ward of the West. On the Russian side, the demographic cost is also immense, with hundreds of thousands of casualties, but Russia's strategic calculation is that this sacrifice secures its long-term security perimeter and its leverage in a future confrontation with its real competitor, China. For Washington, that is the key. The United States cannot contain China effectively if Russia remains pushed into Beijing's arms as a junior partner. It needs to stabilize the European front, lock in a settlement in Ukraine, and then pivot fully to the Indo-Pacific, closing choke points like the Danish Straits or the Arctic routes if needed, but ideally doing so with Russia as a tacit partner rather than a hostile ally of China. That is why Trump's team wants this war ended on terms. Russia can accept why they want Europe out of the room and why they are simultaneously squeezing Maduro in Venezuela, re-engineering the U.S. media ecosystem by sidelining legacy outlets in favor of new media. The Pentagon now openly welcomes and framing all these moves within a doctrine of restoring U.S. strategic freedom in a multipolar world. In the end, the likely trajectory is grim but clear. Unless something unexpected happens, a sudden collapse of the Ukrainian government, a dramatic and credible decision by Washington to cut off military and intelligence support, or a radical shift in European politics, Russia will continue to advance, probably taking full control of the remaining Donbass areas and potentially cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea, including Odessa. Only when the territorial map reflects the underlying strategic reality will Europe be forced to admit that its narrative of holding the line was a self-deception. Then, and only then, will a ceasefire or peace agreement be politically possible in European capitals. Until that moment, the real negotiations will take place between Washington and Moscow, with Kyiv as an increasingly weakened proxy and Europe left outside the door, told, in effect, to stay out of the adults' room while the fate of Ukraine and a large part of the future European security architecture is decided